Our speaker today is Mike Kintgen from Colorado, from Denver, Colorado. Mike is the senior horticulturist at the Denver Botanic Gardens, where he is in charge of 9 gardens there in Denver, including the world-renowned Alpine and rock art. Mike has a BS degree in landscape horticulture from Colorado State University in Fort Collins. He has interned at the Chicago Botanic Garden and also at the Rhododendron Species Foundation in the state of Washington. Mike is currently the chair of the Rocky Mountain chapter of the North American Rock Art Society. Now, in his plant explorations, even though he's still very young, he has gone and looked at plants and photographed plants in Morocco, Spain, the Alps, Alaska, Hawaii, and Argentina. And he's here today to talk about his trip last year to Argentina, including Patagonia. Please welcome Mike Kintgen.
Can you all hear me okay? Is that good? Well, thank you for inviting me down to North Carolina. It's a great honor. Heard about kind of the horticultural hotspot that Raleigh and this area is for quite some time. So it's a big honor to be here today, so I appreciate that. It's kind of cool just to see a very different flora from where I'm from in Colorado, which many of you probably know is a semi-arid continental climate. So it's almost the exact opposite of everything here in North Carolina. We have about 15 inches of precipitation a year in a good year. This year we've had about 10 inches. It gets very cold in the winter. We're technically zone 5 in Denver, so it can go to almost 20 below, although it hasn't done that in a while. And then we get very hot in the summer. We get as hot as you do. We hit 105 twice this past summer. And we broke our all-time record for days above 90 degrees. We had 72 days above 90 this summer. So it was quite a toasty summer, so to say. Very, very different from here. There's no native trees on the plains where Denver is, really, except the cottonwood, which grows along perennial streams. So the plant material that you're going to see where we went in Argentina is probably pretty different than what you guys would expect to grow here in your own gardens, but hopefully it'll still be of interest to you. There's some really nice photos of little rock gardening and fun plants. So these are just kind of a menagerie of shots from around Argentina. A little bit of background to why we chose to go to Argentina. This trip was paid for by a program called Plant Select, which is a cooperation between Denver Botanic Gardens, Colorado State University, and then the Colorado and Rocky Mountain region green industries, the nurseries in the area. And the idea for the program is to promote underused plant material that does very well in those conditions that I talked about. Low precipitation, fluctuating temperatures, alkaline soil, desiccating winds, all that stuff. So very different from here. And the program's been going now, there's almost 16 years of introductions. And a lot of the introductions have come from Denver Botanic Gardens' existing collections. And in particular, an individual that most of you probably know, Panayiotis Keladiz, has done quite a bit of collections, so they've relied on those in the past. But they realized, in talking to the staff at Denver Botanic Gardens and Panayiotis, that they needed to fund some exploration trips to get new material to continue the program going. So they chose 2 areas. We're focusing on what we call steppe regions of the world. And there are 4 steppe regions in the world. The one that we're probably most familiar with is in Western North America, which Denver sits right in the middle of. Steppe climate is defined by those things that I talked about: semi-arid, continental, fluctuating temperatures, stuff like that. The other regions that you find steppe climates in the world would be Central Asia, the steppes of Central Asia, which are very famous. A little bit of South Africa has a steppe climate, which is where a lot of the Delospermas and some of the hardy succulents that Panayiotis is famous for introducing came from. And then Patagonia is the 4th steppe region in the world. And it's the least explored. And the plant material from there has had the least experience in cultivation, and traditionally it's been very difficult, but a lot of it has not been currently cultivated in a neighboring steppe climate. A lot of it's been done by the British in a maritime climate, which is very, very different from where these plants are native. So we're hopeful that some of this stuff will adapt to Colorado, obviously not become noxious weeds, but become nice, well-behaved garden plants. And then a little more background on this. We are trying to work, since there is commercial ideas behind this, within something that's called the Convention of Biological Diversity that was signed into effect in 1993. So this is a long process. I've been working on the official permitting part for the trip for over 2 years now. And the actual kind of preparation for the trip started in January of 2008. It's almost 5 years in putting together stuff for the trip that took place in January and February of 2011. And currently we're still nowhere near an agreement between Denver Botanic Gardens, Plant Select, and the bodies in Argentina that would need to give us permission to legally collect. But I'm hopeful that with time we will get permission to collect. So with that, we'll look a little bit at the flora and the climate of Patagonia. As I mentioned, very different than areas that you would target for North Carolina. I know Tony Abbott spent a lot of time in northwestern Argentina, where this stuff is probably a lot more adaptable to here, and I saw some of it out here in the garden yesterday. A lot of this stuff may not be very appropriate for North Carolina, but it's cool to look at regardless. So just a couple scenes. A lot of cushion plants there, which is really what I go nuts over. I like all plants, but cushions, buns, and true little alpines are what drive me crazy. So Patagonia, if you love cushion and bun plants, it's one of the best places in the world because the wind blows a lot. They don't joke about the wind. These are a pea relative, an arthrophyllum, so they're related to astragalus and oxytropis, which we have a lot of in western North America. I think there's a few species of astragalus here in the eastern US. This funny picture here of me is next to this is an asteraceous plant, so in the sunflower family. It's an Ardiphyllum bryoides. And this went on Facebook as soon as we took it, because Argentina, ironically, has free Wi-Fi everywhere. So it's really easy to upload pictures so we could keep people abreast of what we were doing. But my cheeky co-patrons at DBG noticed that the wind was blowing out my shirt, so they commented that I looked very buxom in that. The other thing you'll notice, my eyes are closed. It's because the wind is throwing rocks and pebbles into my eyes while that picture is being taken. So I'm very happy to be sitting next to that lovely cushion plant. It's very windy and my hands are braced behind me to keep me upright. Otherwise I would be laying on the ground just like the cushion plants. And then a close-up of another species of an arthrophyllum further north, up in northern Patagonia. So here's some of the vegetation of Argentina itself. To kind of orientate people. The capital, Buenos Aires, is right there. I think Tony spent time up in this part, in the northwestern part. Most of my time was spent here in the southern part of the country. We covered a latitude of roughly 38 degrees south to about 50 degrees south. So in the western US, the equivalent of that would be going from southern Colorado to southern Canada and Banff. So it was quite an array of territory that we covered. We drove 4,600 miles in a period of 4 weeks, my coworker and I. And it was just us. So it was kind of an adventure. I know enough Spanish that I could get us out of most situations. And Dan was good at driving, which was great because we needed that. We joke when we'd come into a town that the clowns had arrived because even though I know enough Spanish, it was pretty humorous for some of the residents. So they definitely, I think we brightened their lives out there on the steppe. The blue area itself is the actual steppe regions of Argentina, and then the bright yellow right above it is a type of vegetation called the monte, which is similar to parts of the desert southwest that you would see in places like Arizona and New Mexico. It's often dominated by creosote bush and some smaller hardy cacti. It's a more arid region than the actual steppe, which is more like, if any of you have been to the western Great Plains and the short grass prairies, it can be a lot like that, or if any of you have been to Wyoming where it's dominated by the sagebrush, parts of it are a lot like that as well. You could take literally scenes from parts of Argentina and they could be almost Wyoming. Just the plants are a little bit different. And then hidden here, you have the Andes mountain range that runs along. So this darker blue strip is actually the forested regions, which are dominated by a forest of what they call southern beech, which are nothophagus, which are distantly related to the beech that you have in the woods here, except they're kind of cool that there's both deciduous and evergreen species. There are a few conifers mixed in as well, but unlike mountain ranges of the northern hemisphere where you have spruce and pine and fir that tend to dominate the montane forest, their montane forests are dominated by deciduous trees, so it gives kind of a different look. And then I think the purple, there's some glaciers and lakes in there as well. We went far enough south that the glaciers were reaching out onto the steppe itself. We didn't go all the way down here because eventually the temperatures stay moderate enough in the summer from the ocean that I don't think the plant material will have the heat tolerance that it would need for Colorado. It's kind of a physical map showing the elevations. The elevations are moderate in the southern part of Argentina compared to Colorado. They're not moderate compared to here, but the highest mountains in the southern part of the Andes are only about 12,000 feet. And then a lot of the steppe itself ranges from sea level to about 1,000, 2,000 feet. So it's very different from where I come from, where we start at about 5,000 feet. Some of the landscapes, this is the range where we went. This bottom photo is a place called El Chalten, which is in the far southern part. This is about 50 degrees south, and it's famous for Cerro Fitzroy, which is this peak here. It's a sheer peak of granite. And then also Cerro Torre right here, which is literally the tower mountain. The southern Andes in this part are more granitic. Obviously, they're famous for some of the volcanic peaks that are there, but the volcanoes are more dispersed here. So you have quite a bit of granite and actually sedimentary rocks. And then up north in the province of Neuquén, so in northern Patagonia at about 38 degrees south, you have the famous volcano Lamine, which is the namesake for a national park, and then of course the famous Araucaria monkey puzzle trees. This was a good road. Not all the roads were paved. We were prepared for really bad roads, but you can only prepare yourself so much. Some days were probably 150 miles on dirt road. And I don't think they like road graders or something. And the rocks are big. The rocks that they use, some of them are like that. So the biggest fear is when the big trucks come by and they throw those rocks and break your windshield. Amazingly, for driving 4,600 miles, we never had a broken windshield, but with the big trucks driving, it creates some really odd ruts in the road. So in the middle of the road, you have this pile of that big rock. And we were in a high clearance vehicle, but it wasn't high enough. And when we drive on the road, sometimes there'd be this grating noise of we were actually, I guess, grading the road for them. And sometimes it was easier to actually drive in the ditch. A little less noisy, so we did that. But other times the roads were like this, and they were good, but it was a wide array of anything. It's a stunning country, as you guys can see from the natural scenery, and the people were extremely friendly, especially in Patagonia, because it's really sparsely populated. It's very similar to the western U.S. So in the landscape up north, again, this is on the actual steppe. You can see Lanin in the distance, the big volcano. It does not actually rise by itself. It's just it sticks so high above the surrounding peaks. that when you're far enough out on the steppe, it seems to be an isolated mountain. And as you guys probably know, the south side of the mountains are the shady side there. So the glaciers are on the actual south side of the mountain, while the north side of the mountain, the glaciers aren't present there. So some of the vegetation here, these are bulinums, which are big spiny cushion plants in the parsley or carrot family, believe it or not. The carrot family does some really awesome things down there because of the wind. And then there's a hardy form, or potentially hardy form of pampas grass there. In Denver, Colorado, Cordaderia celoana is really borderline. Even the quote-unquote hardier cultivars will come through the winters, but they don't always perform well. So this is Cordaderia arcana. And I'm amazed, just in literature and internet searches, I don't know if this is currently in cultivation, which is really odd because it's very similar to celoana, but it should be very, very cold hardy comparatively. The leaves are still razor sharp. It has all the outstanding qualities of celoana. Big lakes. The area was heavily glaciated, especially as you go further south. And some of the lakes are almost 80 miles long going back in the mountains. They're very deep because they were carved by glaciers. There's a beautiful lake. You can see what the wind does to those waves. Some of them are almost as tall as I am. Being from a very landlocked state, I don't like large waves. But it was a very beautiful scene. And then this is kind of in central Patagonia in a town called San Carlos de Bariloche, which is a very famous town for people that like plants and people who like to ski. It's a resort town. It's built to look a little bit like Europe. It was settled by German immigrants. And I was expecting German precision when we arrived. But the traffic there was actually some of the most insane traffic of the trip. Because there's very few traffic lights in this town, very few stop signs. If any of you have driven in any Spanish-speaking country in the New World, all those driving rules that you learn there apply here. Most of the towns we were in were small enough that traffic wasn't a problem. But because San Carlos Bariloche is a big resort town, there's a lot of people that come from Buenos Aires for the summer to escape to the cool, dry air. So it gets a little hectic in the summer. It sits on a big lake as well, which you can see over here in the distance, Lago Noel Wapi, which is a native name. And plant lovers, those of you that subscribe to Alpine Garden Society and Scottish Rock Garden Society, will know this mountain. This is Cerro Catedral, literally the cathedral mountain. And that's where the ski area is, so you can ride ski lifts all the way up into the Alpine. So it's a great area to access the Alpine vegetation without having to climb it. One thing that's kind of interesting, these trees in the foreground are pines from California, Mexico, and Western North America. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Argentina did a bunch of experimentation with bringing in all these different woody trees for potential timber industry, and they brought in a lot of pines. And some of them are very, very happy now in the southern foothills of the Andes, and they are starting to naturalize. And right now, the Argentines, for the most part, are pretty happy with it because here's trees that are a potential source of timber and stuff like that, because a lot of the native species grow very, very slow. So they're not great timber species. But you can see the pines, unfortunately, really love what we call the ecotone between the steppe and the actual forest. So this is steppe here, and then on the mountains you have the actual forested regions where there's enough precipitation to support trees. And so the pines really love that transition zone, and they're really taking it over. And it's unfortunate because that's one of the richest zones in the southern Andes, because you have that influence from the wetter forest to the west, and then the influence from the drier steppes to the east. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in 50 to 100 years. A close-up of part of San Carlos de Bariloche. It's a nice city of about 93,000 full-time residents, 2 universities there. There is one historic arboretum there that's about 90 years old that actually did a lot of the work to bring in those different tree species to see how they acclimated to Argentina, and it's still working. And then a close-up of Cerro Cathedral itself. You can see why they call it the Cathedral Peak. It is a granitic mainly, but I think there's some volcanic intrusions on it which form those pillars. This is in mid-January, so the equivalent of mid-July in the northern hemisphere, so you can see there's still a little bit of snow up on top. And then, so the first day that we got to San Carlos de Bariloche, we went up Cerro Cathedral itself. Being a big fan of Alpines, I needed to see the Alpine as soon as I could. So up we went. As I mentioned, this is in mid-January. Unfortunately, the day we went up was really cold, and the clouds were comparatively low, as you can see. So this is a Senecio, another yellow composite, just like the western part of the US. There's a ton of yellow composites there, which drives everyone crazy. Very difficult to identify. And this would be an evergreen kind of shrubby plant in the garden, similar to lavender or something like that. It was actually starting to snow when we got to the top, which being from Colorado, I'm used to snow in midsummer. It happens. But it was a little chilly, a little damp. Another Senecio. We have a lot of Senecios in Colorado. It's one of the families or genera of plants that really have diversified in the steppe regions of the world. You can actually find them in all 4 steppe regions, which is kind of interesting. That those 4 steppe regions have a lot in common, not just with the actual families, but often with the specific genera that you would find. Now salvias, these are some of the weird things of South America. They are in the aster family, but there is some very odd looking stuff down there, which is awesome. That's the kind of stuff that drives me crazy, that I would love to get permission to collect seed of someday. And the salvias range from the Alpine all the way down to the steppe. They've definitely filled all of the niches there. Close up of one after it's out of flower, it looks like something more from Mars. Spiny little things. There's a lot of grazing pressures from guanacos and other things like llama relatives and stuff like that. So a lot of the plants have developed spiny adaptations. Ericia, they look like primula, but they're more closely related to penstemons, foxglove, stuff like that. So they used to be in Scrophulariaceae, the foxglove family, but now they are probably in the Plantago family, which makes people in the Penstemon Society foam at the mouth. But that's okay. I'm like, the plants are still the same, people just changed their name. So Ericias are pretty cool. There's 4 or 5 species in the southern Andes, and they all look very different. This one looks the least like a foxglove. Oxalis, one of the famous oxalises of the southern Andes. This one's actually sold by the Dutch bulb industry. However, in Colorado, the Dutch strain doesn't persist in the garden very long. So we were hopeful to eventually collect some other strains that might be longer lived in the garden, because this plant ranges from the Alpine all the way down into the steppe. So when you have a plant that has a wide natural range like that, you're probably going to have a lot of different adaptations, and you should be able to pick some form that would adapt to cultivation in Denver. And that was the other idea kind of behind this trip, is a lot of the South American plants that are cold hardy, we think were collected on the Chilean side of the mountains, way back in the 1800s, early 1900s. And so they're standard in the industry in the Pacific Northwest, which tends to have a climate very similar to Chile. But a lot of this stuff crosses over the mountains and even into the steppe. Things like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Emborthium coccineum, the Chilean fire shrub. Growing up, I always thought that that was something strictly for the Pacific Northwest, but it is actually a plant that comes down into that transition between forest and steppe. So it's a plant that makes it into semi-arid regions with wind and drought like that, and hot temperatures. So if we're allowed eventually to collect material from that germplasm, it'd be very interesting to see how it performed in Colorado. So close-up of a big one. Because it was cloudy, we never ever saw open flowers on this plant sadly. Down in the steppe, it was long done by the equivalent of midsummer and had gone dormant. Do any of you, have you tried this in your own gardens? You can order it from veg bulb companies. Mulinums, this is a parsley relative again. This is another genus that I think is pretty much endemic in South America. They range anywhere from big mounds to these flat cushion-like things. These are the actual seed heads on it. The seed heads itself are a little bit more ornamental than the flowers. If any of you have spent time in Western North America, we have similar relatives that grow in the Alpine and Steppe, but they aren't quite this cool. A close-up of those seeds, kind of four-winged things, very, very cool plants. And a lot of the mats are evergreen. Loasa nana, this is in the Loaceae family, which is famous for its stinging hairs. We have a few outliers of this family in Western North America, and some of them might even come into the east. The Manzelias, the blazing stars, are related. Luckily, our versions don't have the stinging hairs. They just feel like a piece of sandpaper. But this definitely has stinging hairs. I told Dan that, and he's like, let's find out. So he had to touch it. It wasn't terrible, but later he's like, my fingers hurt. And I'm like, yeah, not surprised. There's another one called electric shock plant that literally feels like an electric shock. Panioti must have grown it in the rock garden at one point, and there was a little self-sown seedling hiding in a bunch of bindweed one day when I was weeding, and I touched it, and I wasn't sure what the heck happened. Did I get stung by an insect? So I put my hand on a piece of cactus, and then parting the bindweed gently, trying not to touch whatever I touched again, I found that there's this little plant with lovely little stinging hairs. Our propagator makes everyone touch the electric shock plant that he grows in the greenhouse. I think it's kind of mean. He doesn't warn them, but if you know a propagator, I don't touch anything that he puts in front of me without asking a few questions first. These are kind of what rock gardeners and alpine plant enthusiasts know South America for, are the actual rosulate violets, which is a really interesting adaptation to the harsh conditions there. We all know violets. You guys have some very nice dwarf ones even around here. But these form basically a succulent rosette, and then they flower all around. They've been traditionally very difficult in cultivation because most of them are high elevation plants growing in screes or areas of lava dust and stuff like that. We were lucky to hit some of them in full flower, which was a lifelong dream for mine, even though that may not be that long. So there's Viola sacculus. Gaultheria. Some of you guys may know Gaultheria. I think there's one or two species maybe down here. I know there's one in Michigan where my dad grew up. We have one species high in the Rockies where the soil is acidic. So it's kind of cool to see those ties of families between different regions. There's species have both these lovely pink berries and then white berries and then a maroon form as well. This is probably not something that we would select for cultivation in Colorado just because it probably wants an acidic soil. Just some of the habitat along the moist stream side. You can see the vegetation is very low, just like it would be on the alpine tundra in the Rockies or on Mount Washington in New Hampshire. Valeriana, which is kind of a cool thing as well. We have Valeriana here in North America, and there's several species in Colorado. Patagonia, they're found from the Alpine all the way down in the steppe. If you guys can't tell, I'm pretty nerdy, and I like those relationships between families and the genera and stuff like that. This plant's really tiny. There's moss in there for scale. Perfect rock garden plant, kind of stuff that I go nuts over. This is a ranunculus. They have some really weird buttercups down there. There's white and pink buttercups in the Alps as well, but in North America we only have a handful of species of that are white. And this is one of those holy grails of the southern Andes. Very, very difficult to grow. Once again, probably not a plant that we picked for Plant Select. I did see a living plant of this in the collection at Gothenburg Botanic Gardens in Sweden, but they had not flowered it yet. But just to even have a plant in a clay pot about that big around and that tall was quite an accomplishment. Because it grows in screes that are fed with snowmelt. So it loves cool, oxygenated water flowing beneath its roots, which is difficult even in Denver. Close up with the flowers. I thought we'd be too late for this in midsummer, but in a couple of the snow patches, they were still around. It was great. Here's another of those Ericias. This one looks a little bit more like a penstemon. I think it is probably hummingbird pollinated. It grows along the cold streams. I think they can grow this in the UK and probably the Pacific Northwest. Anagalus is another kind of interesting genus of plants because it tends to be cosmopolitan. I collected a bright orange form of Anagalus monellii in Morocco. It has been a short-lived perennial plant for us in Colorado. So it's kind of cool to see a little Anagalus there on the Alpine because we also have a dwarf species in Colorado. So once again, it's just kind of reinforcing that relationship between steppe regions of the world. These, believe it or not, are in the Primula family. I don't know where genetic studies have put them lately. Who knows, they may have even thrown them right into the middle of Primula because they seem to be saying that Dodecathians and Dionysia are all Primula, which makes me a little uncomfortable, but that's okay. Primula, this is Primula magellanica, so there's one Primula down there, which is very interesting. To my knowledge, South Africa has no native Primulas, so there's a little bit of influence of the northern hemisphere in Patagonia, which is it's interesting because obviously it's a long way from the northern hemisphere. So that stuff may migrate down the Andes. Some of it may have to do with bird migrations as well. There's a couple professors at universities in Colorado that are actually studying some of the insect, bird, and then especially the bryophyte for mosses and lichen relationships between Colorado and Patagonia. So it's interesting. This looks very similar to a primula that grows in some of our high mountain parks in Colorado. Another rosulate violet. So we'll just put a lot of pictures of this in because it's kind of like plant porn for people. So we'll just go through quickly and see they live in rocky environments. Really cute. They're only about that big around. Kind of stuff. Like I said, it just makes me drool. Close up of it. A lot of the flowers were closed because it was cloudy. There's one kind of open. There's another species of Ericea. This is Alpine. Really nice plant. True alpine plants, so once again, not something for Plant Select, but something that I could definitely try in the Rock Alpine Garden in PG. Close up of the flowers, you can see definitely it's more closely related to foxgloves and all that stuff, or wherever it lies now. This is kind of a vignette of some of the vegetation that you might find on the mountain with different mats of eulinums, senecio, stuff like that. There's very few flowers in there, but just those seed heads and the nice silver leaves, it makes an interesting component to the landscape. Close up of one of the eulinums. These are in the parsley family again, very spiny, adaptation probably to grazing pressures. And I don't know if these stay evergreen looking or not in the winter. That's something that would be very interesting if they would stay bright green or even a dull green for us in the winter. That would be great because Denver is often described as a broadleaf evergreen hell. So we always are looking for things that stay green in the winter. We have some wonderful western natives that we can use, but we'd love to expand that palette. Ericea, these are in the aster family. The family goes kind of nuts in South America. I think there might be one or two species that make it up into Mexico, if I remember right. There's tons of little alpine ones down there. Okay, moving down on this step, so we've left the alpine big focus of this trip was more those steppe regions, and especially that ecotone between the forest and the actual steppe itself, because that's where we surmised that the plant material would be the most adaptable to Colorado and the Rocky Mountain West. So this is on the steppe east of Bariloche. So we're getting out beyond the trees. These are Austrocedrus, which are related to the Calocedrus that you'd see in California and Oregon. They look almost identical in their leaves, but they behave in the environment more like a juniper. So they're the last tree to give out on the steppe as it gets too dry to support woody plants. And the unusual thing, for me at least, about the steppe of South America, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we have cottonwoods on the plains of Colorado and one willow that approaches tree size. Really, the steppes of Patagonia have no native woody trees, except, oddly enough, one species of willow again. But that only grows in the northern and central part of Patagonia. So when you get to the southern steppe, there's really no trees that are native. So there's been a lot of trees brought in for planting shelter beds from that famous wind that I keep alluding to. And ironically, the most common planted tree on the steppe is Lombardy poplar. So lots and lots of Lombardy poplar. Once again, you have mulinums in here along the road. I think these are Salvias, stuff like that. There's just the landscape with the mulinums in flower, some festucas and things related to what we'd have on the steppe in Colorado. There's stipas, although now I think they're Nacellas or whatever. There's a creeping hardy or potentially hardy nasturtium out in there. So very nice looking landscape, very different from here on the East Coast. These are Junellias, which are related to Berbenias. The Berbenia family does some really awesome things down there. Actually, it's probably the motherland of Verbenaceae, filling every niche possible that it could. And a lot of the Junellias take on the form of cushions and mats or large shrubs. There is one Berbenia relative that looks like a broom down there, and some of them were almost as high as like the lights in here, which is really weird to see a Berbenia that looks like a broom. These are covered with flower in the right season. We were there at the end of the flowering season since it was the equivalent of July. It's getting pretty dry out on the steppe. Close up of one cushion that still have flowers. These have entered cultivation a little bit more through people interested in alpine. So it's the high alpine species or the really tiny ones. And they've done okay. I'm really curious to see what some of these steppe species would do in cultivation in the steppe climate, because I think they have excellent potential to be a nice flowering mound this season. Unlike you, we don't have lollipops of azaleas and stuff like that, so the public is just waiting for something that could be so perfect and covered with flower in season. There's an arthrophyllum. These are those pea relatives related to Astragalus and Oxytropis. It's a spiny cushion. Again, it's out of flower in this picture. It's July. Here it is in flower. Was lucky enough to actually make 2 trips to Argentina last year. I went back in November for a conference and to continue to try and help the relationships with our contacts in Argentina. So I flew back out to Bariloche for, I think, about 5 days, and I was able to spend some time with some local botanists out there. So we went, and this is actually the exact same plant that you saw in the photo before, blooming in the equivalent of a Patagonian spring. So you can see a very, very striking plant. Traditionally, they are said to be impossible to grow, but there's a woman in Calgary, Canada that's had some success with them. Calgary also is in a steppe climate. So it's promising that these might work in somewhere like Denver. And then, as I mentioned, the parsley family does some amazing things. These are buns or cushions of an azarella. We grow one azarella, or bolax now I think it's called in Colorado, called the plastic plant, which literally does look kind of like astroturf or something like that. It's bright green and shiny all year long. It's done very well in Colorado, so that was one of the things that helped me think about this trip that, okay, if this plant does very well from Patagonia, then theoretically there should be other things that would work. So we'd love to get our hands on this, because as I mentioned, anything that's cushion and bun forming, just start drooling and going nuts. Here's a landscape of a different azurella. You can get these big dry playas or dried up lake bed that's dominated by this plant. Some of those cushions are 5 feet across. So it was like being in a fairy tale for me to skip amongst cushions and stuff. You'll notice, it's interesting, this is a wild chamomile. A lot of the noxious weeds of Patagonia are the same noxious weeds that we battle in Colorado, which isn't surprising because the climates are very similar. So all the things that are problems in Colorado are pretty much there now, unfortunately, and they're very, very happy. Haplopapis or Grindalia, depending on who you ask. We have gum weeds in the western U.S. I don't know if there's any species here in the eastern U.S. There might be. They're called gum weeds because often the base here is sticky. And there's one species in Argentina that they are actually growing for resin production. But this would be a great little rock garden plant. It was blooming in the equivalent of July down on the steppe, where a lot of stuff had finished. So it looks like it has a long period of flower. It'd be great. Here's just some of the landscape as we actually moved further out on the steppe. It gets drier as you go from west to east. So in the western part of the Andes, where you get the oceanic influence in Argentina, you can have probably upwards of 80 inches of precipitation a year. That's where those really nice forests reside that are very similar to our Pacific Northwest. And then as you move east, it gets drier and drier until you end up in something like this. Or when you get almost to the coast of the Atlantic, it gets even drier. It has about 10 inches of precipitation a year, which makes it a true desert. So the vegetation becomes even sparser. But I love landscapes like this because this is what I grew up in. A lot of people are like, what? There's plants out there? I'm like, yes, there are. Brachyclados, this is in the aster family again, another cushion-forming thing. Really great blooming in midsummer, which is a nice thing. A lot of alpines and rock garden plants tend to have their big show in the spring. So I'm always looking for things that would extend the season of interest. A couple of things I should point out. Bone there were lots and lots of bones littering the landscape, which led Dan and I to surmise that Patagonia is a very difficult place, and there's a lot of death of living organisms. Because wherever we stopped the car, there would be bones of livestock or some of the native wildlife. We just hoped that our bones didn't join the piles. We didn't find any human remains that we know of. Close up. Steppe can be very heavily grazed, as you can see by the cow pie there. Some more cushions. So in the foreground here, the silver is an Arthrophyllum again, which is a key relative, and then an Azurella in the background. Excuse me, it's an Adesmia, not an Anarthrophyllum. And Adesmias are even weirder than the Anarthrophyllums because they range from little cushion plants all the way up to shrubs that, if you guys are familiar with Caragena, the pea shrubs of Central Asia, there's things that look like that. So it's a really interesting genus of plants. Most of them are spiny or poisonous. Close up with a few flowers on it, you can definitely see the relative to peas. Another Haplopapis or Grindalia. This one I have not been able to put a name on, and we only saw it once on the trip, and it was growing in roadside gravel. It's kind of an interesting plant. I need to talk to the botanist down there showing pictures and see if they could get an ID from it. Close up, we loved how the flowers get this orange tint as they age. We tend to select for very strong, bright colors in the Rocky Mountain region because we have very, very harsh sunlight. So a lot of pastel colors, while they don't actually fade, there's that optical illusion due to the strong sunlight that they don't show up as well in the garden. So we like oranges and bright colors. Brachyclados again on the steppe in full flower, amazing plants. I don't know if that's in cultivation or not. There's another, the Peresias, they can come in blue. I'm a sucker for blue flowers. Anything blue, my past intern would always bug me. He's like, oh, it's blue, so you must like it. Yeah, nothing wrong with that. I'd love, this is kind of flirted with cultivation. It might still be in cultivation in Great Britain, but I don't think it's currently in cultivation here in North America. There's none of those plants you find it way up in the Alpine and all the way down to the steppe. So there's got to be some adaptability in there. We were able to, we had a rental car that had high clearance, but to go up on this plateau, or the meseta, we actually arranged in one of the little towns we were in to have a gentleman with a truck drive us up there. And we definitely needed the truck, because even with this truck, we knocked a couple rocks in the road. And there was one particular one, he's like, I hit that every time, and I'm hoping eventually I'll knock it loose, and we can move it out of the road. But it was amazing to go up on this plateau. It was about maybe 4,000 feet above sea level, but it's high enough that it's almost alpine. The wind was amazing up there. So was the scenery. In the center of the screen here, you ever heard of guanacos, which are the native llama-like creatures that run across the steppe. And then in the far background, you have Montes de Bajos in the clouds there, which is high enough that it has glaciers on it. It's a big extinct volcano. Another Adesmia on the actual meseta there, and you'll notice the stuff that looks like sand is all volcanic ash. There's a big volcanic eruption about 20 years ago in that region that just showered this area with ash. And the town that we were staying in is along one of those large lakes, so the climate is moderated by the lake. So it's actually a cherry growing region and a soft fruit growing region that can grow raspberries and stuff like that. The ash came down thick enough that it killed all the cherry orchards. And so the region has just recovered. The cherry trees are old enough now to bear again. And last summer, that same volcano was kind of stirring to action, so people were nervous. I think it's behaving itself for now, but that's the other thing we battled besides incessant wind, bumpy roads, was the volcanic dust still blowing around after 20 years. I had dust in places that I never knew dust could go. There's a mulinum. I've never been able to put a name on this particular one, but it basically forms like a fuzzy cushion like a dreba. Really awesome plant growing on the side of a rock. We only saw this, I think, on this particular plateau. There's a lot of endemicism amongst the plants of Patagonia. Ironically, when you get into really arid regions, you do have high plant diversity. And you can have a lot of plants that are very particular to a small region. We have that in the western US, with a lot of species that are found on particular substrates. Very similar in Patagonia, South Africa, and Central Asia as well. Benthomelia, this is in the potato petunia family. So basically, this is a cushion-forming potato. It doesn't form tubers, or think of it as a cushion-forming petunia relative. But totally up my alley. You can see the volcanic ash in there for scale, so it's a tiny plant. Once again, probably not something for Plant Select. That's okay, we saw plenty of stuff that would keep them happy. Mulinum Canis on the edge of, I think this is a volcanic crater. It's called Lago Hondo, literally the deep lake. The wind was blowing so hard on the edge of this lake, even though the vegetation looks pretty still. Remember, it's stiff, so it doesn't move much in the wind. I could barely stand, because I keep joking with the staff back home. Yes, I'm lightweight. Doesn't seem like much for the winds to blow me around, but remember, I can turn sideways and greatly reduce my surface area. There's a lot of times that I spent sideways in that wind, and it was still harsh. And actually, even that lake that was like 200 feet below the surface of the plateau, there were white caps on it, so the wind was really blowing. These are some of the Junellias that alpine enthusiasts would go nuts over. These have done well in cultivation at the higher elevations of Colorado, in places like Vail and Steamboat Springs. There's that Perezi again that you saw down on the steppe, growing up almost in the Alpine. All volcanic rocks in this region. Close up of the flowers. There aren't many blue flowers down there. There's a lot of yellow, a lot of white, a little bit of orange, some red, but very few blue. It's kind of interesting. Some of the landscape on the steppe near that plateau. In parts of the Andes, it's so dry from the rain shadow effect of the actual mountains themselves that you get very few forested areas. There's almost no transition between the steppe to the Alpine. The Alpine just climbs, or the steppe climbs right up to the Alpine, which you don't get very much in Western North America. You get it probably in parts of Central Asia and South Africa where there's fewer tree species. So on the foreground here, you have a lot of stipas and I think some eulinums and stuff. As we actually climbed a pass there. These are mountains on the Chilean border. Pretty spectacular. We're getting far enough south that the glaciers are becoming larger and larger and more common at rather moderate elevations. That snow/glacier there is probably only at about 5,000 or 6,000 feet. The big cushions of azarellas blended into the landscape here. They kind of blend in, but these are giant cushions that I could have laid on. I wouldn't do anything like that. You know, I'm probably like a piece of paper lying on them, but astragalus, they do have a few astragalus. You find those in at least 3 of the steppe regions of the world. I don't know if there's any in South Africa, but there's big centers of distribution for astragalus in Western North America, and then again in Central Asia. I think astragalus is actually the biggest genus in the Fabaceae. There's one of the rosulate violets down south, thing here. This one was of great interest to us because it's orange and yellow flowered. Most of those rosulate violets tend to be whites, purples, mauves, stuff like that. So this one can be a bright orange in its good forms. Unfortunately, we arrived too late to see it in flower. The cushions of Impetrum, I don't know if Impetrum makes it this far south, but it's definitely in the northeastern U.S., up in Michigan and places like that. It used to be a heather relative, although I think sometimes it's thrown in its own family. Not sure why, because it looks just like anything in the heather or rhododendron family to me, but it's very interesting that you have this southern hemisphere counterpart to our northern hemisphere counterpart. The only difference is this has red berries, while I think the ones in the northern hemisphere have blackberries. This, once again, would probably not be a plant for Denver because it grows up in the high elevations. More azarella cushions. Sorry, you'll probably get sick of seeing cushions. There's calceolarias, which is another famous genera from South America. Most of them tend to be concentrated on the Chilean side of the mountains, and they make it all the way up into Mexico, with a lot of them in Ecuador and Peru, which obviously are not good potentials for cultivation in Colorado. But there's a handful that make it far enough south. There's even a handful that make it out onto the steppe, which is very interesting to us because most species in cultivation from Chile come from those maritime wet woodlands or high alpine areas. This is a high alpine, but this is kind of the holy grails of the southern Andes. So it's awesome to see one last flower on it. It's literally only about that tall. And Dan, my travel partner, is not really into alpines, which is good. You know, diversity makes the world go round. He's like, okay, are you ready to go? And I'm like, no, look at the calceolaria. He's like, back in the car. And I showed it to my parents even, and I'm like, this was one of the things I totally wanted to see on the trip. And they're like, it looks kind of sickly or something. Okay, whatever. Here's a really cool azarella with white edges to the leaves. Very tiny species. This would be like a trough. or definitely a rock garden plant. Just going back down the other side of the pass as we kind of get into that transition zone between the actual steppe and the alpine. Again, Mulinum cushions, festucas, all the stuff that you'd find in steppes kind of around the world. And then further down on the steppe where it gets drier. Initially, I ID'd this as a species of plantago or plantain, believe it or not. They even have cushion-forming plantagos. But that species, sempervirens, is supposedly only alpine, so this was way below the alpine. So it may actually be a species of azarella. There wasn't enough seeds or flowers on it to truly figure out what it was. A very cool cushion plant. Furry, you can see an adaptation to the cold and wind. See the same adaptation in alpine plants all around the world. You can see the wind has even thrown some nice pebbles on it. Also, we're hitting my face, I think, while I was taking this picture. And then this is a pretty weird plant. Believe it or not, there is one perennial cushion-forming petunia that is endemic in the far southern part of Patagonia. And this is it, Petunia patagonica. It's jumped genera a couple times too. Botanists can't quite decide where it belongs. It's been to Nirenbergia. It's back to Petunia. Some of these cushions are 7, maybe almost 8 feet across. So they're really ancient, and they build up of actual woody trunks underneath, so it's more like a shrub. The flowers are flesh-colored to white with dark veining, so it is probably not going to be the next proven winner's plant, but that's okay. Here they are again. I went nuts because we do have this plant in cultivation at DBG from a nursery in Canada, and it has been notoriously shy blooming in cultivation. And the British have surmised that it's because the light intensities in Great Britain, because they're at sea level in the maritime climate, aren't high enough for it. But it's been shy blooming for, actually it's never bloomed in Denver, Colorado. And as you know, we have very high light intensity. So I've always been curious if dealing with genetic stock, if we just have poor genetic stock in cultivation, because walking around this colony is very interesting. Unfortunately, they're done flowering, but these are all spent flowers on this cushion, so it had covered itself. Why some of these other ones had no spent flowers on them. So I could be wrong, but I think some particular clones could be very poor flowering, or I don't know, maybe they only flower when they feel like it or whatever. But it's interesting because it has been generally very poor flowering in cultivation. Of course, Gothenburg, when I was there in April of last year, right after this trip, they had a blooming specimen. They're at sea level, high latitude, really poor light intensity. So maybe, like I said, it might deal with the actual stocks that we have in cultivation, and they might have a more heavily blooming form. One more picture of it, really cool plant for Petunia. This is another Junelia, the kind of army green thing here, so that's a Berbinia relative. And then here's that famous silver cushion that you saw me sitting next to at the beginning of the talk, the Nardophyllum. Dan and I both saw this as we drove by. He's like, "Did you see that?" I'm like, "Yes, I did." He's like, "Do you want to turn around?" I'm like, "Yes, I would." I'm like, "But I think it's dead," because we couldn't tell from the road because it's so silver, and we only saw one. And so we walked out to it, and I determined it was still among the living. And Dan took a couple pictures, and he's like, "You seem to really, really like this plant." I do. He's like, "Do you need a few moments with it?" Well, sure. There it is again, close up of it. That's the kind of stuff, like I said, that I go nuts over. A lot of people would probably be like, "Are you sure that's not dead?" Supposedly when it blooms, it has yellow kind of little bottle brush flowers on it because it's in the aster family. But when you're that cool, you don't need the flower. Just moving further out on the steppe where it gets really dry, there's a genus of plants that's pretty much endemic, I think, to South America. Chuscaraggia aurea. It's in the aster family again. They can make giant, giant buns. There was one night we were trying to get to the hotel in some godforsaken town. Normally the hotels there were really nice. The particular night that we saw the giant cushions of this that I wish I'd taken pictures of because they were the size of a Volkswagen Bug. I did not know that cushions could get that big. I can only imagine how old they were. But the light was getting too dark to take photos of it, but so you just have to believe me. But that hotel was terrible. Toilet almost fell over when, obviously Dan and I were using it at separate times, but it almost fell over twice. And the problem is it didn't have a toilet seat, so it's like, oh my gosh, if this truly does fall over, I think I'm going to be stuck in this toilet and Dan's going to have to come and pull me out, or vice versa. Dan had the exact same thought that I was going to have to come rescue him out of the toilet. The bathroom itself was all tiled, which is great. So basically the whole bathroom turned into the shower just because the shower sprayed everywhere, which was okay till I soaked the one roll of toilet paper, which I was then able to use to keep the door shut because the door was so warped from the water that it had sprayed out like a book. So the door didn't really want to close, which was, awkward when you're almost falling in a toilet or awkward when you're taking a shower. But really what bothered me as I started looking around were the bare electrical wires going to light up the fire. I'll try and not soak that. It worked out. We survived. We only stayed there one night. The carpet, which was probably from before the age of Abita, was so full of sand that it was like being on the beach. So luckily my bed was close enough to the shower. After I showered, I put my towel out and launched myself from my towel onto the bed, which was actually comparatively clean. There were no living residents with us. Dan and I were very worried who else would be snuggling up with us for the evening. But the walls were crumbling onto both of our pillows. That was quite an experience. Normally the rooms were excellent, actually. Really nice. But that one was probably the worst hotel room I've ever stayed in. Close up of the Chuscaraggia. It's almost like a everlasting flower. Those petals are dry, so it looks like it's in flower much longer than it actually is. A straw flower or something like that. There's Dan, my colleague, with a cushion-forming ephedra. Yes, they have cushion-forming ephedras as well. This one has white berries, so it's different than a lot of the stuff that we tend to have in cultivation with red berries. Still scared of it. A lot of them tend to sucker with time. There's more of those Azarella patagonicas in a dry lake bed. Pretty amazing landscape. Just with the different lighting on them. Another mulinum, very close to those Azarellas. They're obviously very closely related, both in the parsley family. They actually do have a little bit of a like celery scent or something if you break them. There's another Benthomelia, which has been a cushion-forming Petunia potato relative. We were too late to catch any of these in flower, sadly. Then going all the way back up north, so that was in the far southern part of Patagonia. I drove all the way up to the northern part. This is in a place called Primeros Pinos, which is where the araucarias first appear on the Argentine side. They make it down into the actual steppe. And we're very hopeful that if we were ever allowed to collect germplasm from this particular population, that it might be hardy in Denver, Colorado. It seems right now that the current araucarias in cultivation are just tender enough that they don't like Denver, Colorado. They're able to grow them in the Salt Lake City area, which is zone 7 because it sits on the Great Salt Lake. That lake is big enough that it modifies the climate a little bit for that part of the U.S. With that big Anarthrophyllum cushion in front, this is a different species than you saw at the beginning of the presentation. There's 3 or 4 cushion-forming species. This is a high elevation bamboo, or bamboo in the southern part of the Andes. I originally thought this was Chuskia montana, but my botanist friend said it's probably just Chuskia coolio formed into almost a bond or cushion because it's growing on top of the paths. But Dan and I went nuts over this. We're like, oh my God, a cushion forming bamboo. Like, I didn't know anything existed. There's that Grindalia again, I think. Very adaptable plant. Here it is almost up on the Alpine. Really attractive plant, I think. Close up of the flowers, you can see they're tinged with orange again. Another Azurella. Amazing plant. This is up on top of the actual pass. It's about 6,000 feet. The tree line is a lot lower in Patagonia for several reasons. That the Andes are actually comparatively close to the Pacific Ocean. So you tend to have a lower tree line in mountain ranges that are maritime. And also they've done some, professors that I know there have surmised that because the forest is made up of mainly deciduous species, that the trees just aren't able to grow any higher. They've reached the elevation that they can. If they had things like pines or spruce or fir, the actual tree line may be higher. That's kind of interesting. Armeria marittima, does that tolerate conditions here somewhat? It's interesting because it's native as well in Patagonia. It's one of those really weird plants that you can find in different spots of the world. Obviously, I think most of our cultivated stock comes from European stuff that you find along the seacoast. But we ironically have one species in Colorado as well. It grows on the tundra. It's very, very rare. It's a weird link between the flora of Colorado and the flora of the Altai Mountains in Mongolia, because you find the exact same species. It's kind of outside the aspect of this talk. But if you come to Colorado, there are some species of plants that you find in Colorado, and then you may not see them again until you show up in the Altai Mountains of Mongolia. So there's these very interesting links between these steppe regions. So it was cool to see this down there. The forms down there don't have the clear pink flowers that we generally see in cultivation. So I don't think it's going to be any prize winner. But I'm nerdy. I like it all. So here's another species of roseate violet. This is almost a month after we saw those first ones in flowers. So these were long since done up on this pass. There was one different species. I think we saw 4 or 5 different roseate species the trip. There's another Nassalvia, which is, you saw a picture of the weird one that looked from Mars at the beginning. A little mat forming one. Love this plant. And then this is a really weird buttercup relative. Reminds me of Aranthus, the winter aconite. Do people grow that in their gardens here? Tolerate conditions down here. This wouldn't even like Denver because it grows up on the Alpine in areas that are saturated by snowmelts in the spring and then it disappears. But you can see by the gravel and sand the scale of this plant. And so the yellow flower perches right in the middle of these leaves. But I just love it because it's an alien looking plant. As I mentioned, I was able to go back in November by myself for a conference and to continue working with people down there to strengthen relationships between Denver Botanic Gardens and people in Argentina. So this is a picture at the top of Bariloche on Valentine's Day when I left in early 2011. And then this is in mid-November when I returned. I don't know if any of you remember from the news, there was a large volcanic eruption in Chile that started in June of last year. And it was still going on when I went to western Argentina in November. It had been erupting for about 5 months at that point. The eruption was not as intense as it was in the beginning. If any of you Google like the Ushuaia volcano eruption, June 2011, there's some really spectacular photos of the actual ash cloud, coming out like an atomic bomb with lightning coming through it. This, we just had clouds of ash from time to time when the wind was blowing the wrong way. So you can see the difference the ash made. That's the exact same photo taken, exact same spot. That was one thing. that I tried to do while I was there to compare and contrast. And in parts of Bariloche itself, the ash came down about that thick. Almost a foot of ash fell from the initial volcanic eruption. I guess the initial volcanic eruption was kind of scary because from Bariloche, the volcano's about 60 miles away. They thought it was an electrical storm that was coming because, of course, as it came towards them, it lost that atomic bomb shape. And it just looked like dark clouds filled with lightning because I guess the ash creates the static electricity. So they just thought a really terrible electrical storm was coming. And they said it hit, and instead of rain coming, there was sand falling out of the sky. They knew immediately what was happening, that it was a volcanic eruption. Luckily, I don't think it killed anyone in Bariloche, far enough away that the ash fall was not hot. You can get close enough on the Chilean border where the ash fall was hot enough that I was told that all the forests were scorched. I don't think any people died at all because they kind of knew that it was coming because the earthquakes and stuff had increased in intensity and frequency. So they were prepared. I don't know why in Bariloche, I don't know. I'd be scared to death if ash started falling out of the sky. But here's a view contrasting again. This is along the Rio Lame in early February of 2011, and this is the exact same bend in the river in November 2011 with the ash blowing through the air. Obviously, it makes breathing kind of difficult. We had to wear dust masks and stuff like that on the days that it was blowing through. Other days, if the wind was blowing right, it was pretty clear. You can see the actual ash here lodging against the vegetation. And this ash is really nasty because it's particularly fine. It's like a drywall dust or something. So it has to be terrible for people that are living in it. And then a few things that you might try here in North Carolina. It's kind of a crapshoot, so to say, because the point of this trip was to pick things for a very different set of conditions than you guys have here. But we did spend a lot of time in the Monte province, which has a little bit higher average temperatures. It is drier, so I don't know how this stuff would adapt. But if you grew it in a sand bed or something, it might do very well. So this is a type of creosote bush that you find down there. This is Laurea nitida. I couldn't capture it in the actual photos, but it has very, very shiny green leaves, much prettier than the one that you find in the American Southwest, although I like that plant as well. And then Argentina always delivers plant-wise. There's even a creeping Laurea species down there. When Dan and I saw this from the car, I'm like, stop the car. He's like, okay, go check whatever your cushion thing is. And I came back and I'm like, Dan, I think you're gonna want to see this. He's like, what is it? I'm like, it seems to be a mat-forming species of Laurea. So it's Laurea miguana, which is named after a botanist that did a ton of work in Patagonia. Really cool plants. I don't think it's in cultivation. But you could imagine, I don't know if it'd be hardy for Denver, because I think it only gets probably in the teens are the lowest temperatures that this plant might see in the wild. Maybe brushes into the high single digits. But for parts of the desert Southwest that are pretty cold, like Albuquerque or something, if this would put up with the heat down there, I think people would love a creeping Laurea for landscape use. Obviously very drought tolerant. As long as it could tolerate the precipitation and humidity here, I think it would do fine. Cordaderia, I saw Cordaderia celuana planted along some of the highways yesterday. It's not invasive here, I guess, is it? No, it's bad in California. This is that Cordaderia arcana again. We never actually saw celuana in the wild except at the Buenos Aires airport where it dominated along the runways. It's a really cool plant because it varies in size. It can be 8-10 feet tall and all the way down to about waist height on me. So I think it has a lot of potential, a lot of color variation in the wild from almost pink to good clean whites to dirty browns. Here's Dan standing next to one. The leaves are a little more green than celuana. And I'm really curious if forms like Patagonia and Andes silver are actually forms of Araucana. But when we compared them at DVG to photos we took, they have more gray-green leaves than anything we saw in the field, and or maybe a little more to it. So who knows? It's really odd that this has never potentially made its way into cultivation, if that's true. Some of the cacti you might be able to try. This is Malwania. These are related to prickly pears. Really cool cactus. They're dominating the landscape here. There's different spine forms, red and gold. You can see them, nice gold one there. We grow that in Denver. It was introduced before laws allowed collecting in Argentina. Close-up of the silver spine form of it. It's a really cool little cactus. I think it would probably tolerate a sand bed here. I don't know if anyone's tried Malwania poapigii here. How does that do?
May still be alive.
This might even be better because poapigii is actually a montane species, so it grows higher in the mountains. This makes it out onto the steppe, and this was actually growing in an area that was pretty hot during the day. Their heat doesn't last as long as it does here in North America, but a lot of the areas that we visited on the steppe have record highs of 90 or even the low hundreds, and then record lows depending on where you are in the country from single digits to about 10 below, I think, is what most towns experience. We went to one town which claimed to be the coldest spot in Argentina, where they supposedly recorded a -25 way back in the teens. We were a little disheartened when we drove into the town and it was filled with Italian cypress. There were even some trachycarpus, and I think Italian stone pine, Pinus pinea. Like, yeah, this doesn't look good. I guess it hasn't been cold here for a while. But a lot of the genes are still in those plants. I think it would be worth trying Austrocedrus chilensis here. Has anyone tried it? How's it? That's good. No, that's great. I think they do very well here. It might be one of the few trees, too, that would survive in Colorado. Just because generally the southern hemisphere does not get cold enough for us to grow any of the southern hemisphere trees. Even the hardy eucalypts are like, I'm out of here. Juschia coolio, does that tolerate the heat here? No. Okay, so forget that. I know Tony saw some species in northwest Argentina that are probably better adapted. We can get this to edge through the heat in Denver, but we always cool back off at night. Even if we're 105 during the day, we'll generally be in the high 60s again at night, thanks to our low humidity and high elevation that we cool off. Tennis, has anyone tried that here? These are.
Our collection didn't work.
It didn't work. Was it cold hardiness or heat tolerance?
I'd have to look at the records. I think it was cold.
Was it cold? Because this makes it down to about 40-some degrees south. And historically, the temperatures where these are growing are in the high single digits for the record lows. Like Bariloche has gone to 2. It doesn't do it very often, but Dan knew this tree from California. I guess it's used a lot in the landscape industry in California, and neither of us thought that it would, we didn't even know that it would be here because I think the stock for California comes out of this central valley of Chile, which is a very similar climate to California, that it's Mediterranean. But it'll be interesting if we ever get permission to try this in Denver. I don't have much hope for it because I think it's a broadleaf evergreen, but you never know. Surprises happen all the time. So if yours went from not having cold tolerance, maybe forms from this far south might put up with how chilly it gets here, and in the same time put up with the heat you get. It would be interesting. Really cool tree. They can look like weeping willows in some forms. Other forms are almost perfectly formed, kind of like a lollipop, or like kids draw trees, kind of gumdrop shaped. So a lot of variation in it. It's in the family that euonymuses are in, so you get those same kind of cool fruits that euonymus gets. It's a very ornamental tree. Eryngium paniculatum. Has anyone tried that here?
Good.
It's done well, good. These are cool plants. I like eryngiums, but I like things that are more structural sometimes in the garden. It's not something that my mom's probably going to plant in her garden, but that's okay. I run things by her sometimes. It's like, what do you think of this? She's like, no. Or, yeah, I like that. Okay, that has plant-select potential. There's the araucarias. I heard from Tim yesterday that these actually don't do very well here. Which isn't surprising because they're a montane species, so they probably don't like the high night temperatures in the summer. But you never know. Keep trying. I put this picture in because it shows me, it was a picture that Dan took, just how big they are. Really amazing trees. I was excited to see them. But I put them up there with the redwoods because I didn't realize how giant they got. I think they're just as impressive as redwoods. Obviously not as big, but redwoods don't grow a tree line. So it was kind of humbling to walk among them. And hopefully someday we'll get permission to actually collect seeds from this population to try them in Denver. This is a grass that may do very well here. This is in Buenos Aires, which is a lot more subtropical than here, but it does get somewhat chilly, and I think some of the plant material from around Buenos Aires and the surrounding environs may have enough cold hardiness for you guys. This is from a part in the far southern part of Buenos Aires province. Buenos Aires province is actually extremely large. It's come from the Tandil Hills, which I've never been to. This is at a garden in Patagonia at the equivalent of the USDA. They have a botanic garden at the main site there. Really beautiful ornamental grass. I don't know if it's ever been tried in the US or not, but I think it has potential for places like here. Buenos Aires climate is probably more like Orlando, Florida. I was there in February and just looking around. All the trees that they can grow in Buenos Aires, they had pretty much in Orlando. So they get enough cold in Buenos Aires. They can do things like linden trees, and London plane trees are actually the most common street tree, along with different species of ash and stuff. So it's this really weird juxtaposition of subtropical flora mixed with things that I was familiar with. And then as part of going to the conference that I went to in November, it was a big conference sponsored by the International Society of Horticultural Science, and I presented a paper on plant select. I wasn't actually invited by the International Society of Horticultural Science itself, but I was invited by my contacts in Argentina. They wanted to hear more about what we're doing at our botanic garden. So I came down, and part of the conference was a visit to the INTA site, which is the equivalent of the USDA and the big research site that they're doing there. And they've been doing a lot of work with native Argentine plants for bedding plant industry. And so they had us go through the trial fields and rate stuff. So these are the Myrmidria cultivars that they're working on. Some of them are very similar to Starry Eyes that's sold in this country. But some of them were different too. They had larger flowers, I think. So it's very interesting to see all the work that they've been doing. It'll be interesting to see if they can mass market these things in Argentina. Obviously there are people that garden, especially out in Bariloche, which has that more European feel, and people actually tend to have land that they can garden on. There's gardens that are comparable to English gardens. But in Buenos Aires itself, a lot of people live in apartments and condos and stuff like that. And there were potted plants on people's balconies, but I saw very few flashy annual displays. And maybe that's something that INTA is trying to work on, is promoting the actual bedding plant industry in Argentina itself. A very interesting conference attended from people all around the world. There's some of the tacomas that they're working on. I think these may do very well for you, even as they're so-so. Dieback things, maybe. We can grow straight tacoma stands in its hardy form in Denver as a dieback. They've been doing a lot of breeding with colors. I think it's very similar to the breeding work that I think George Hall is doing in Phoenix, if I remember right. It's kind of interesting that you have these parallel programs sometimes. Here's the actual conference itself. It was a great conference, as I said. It was nice to be invited and be able to talk a little bit more about what we're doing at Denver Botanic Gardens and with the program Plant Select. And hopefully I'll get to go back at some point and legally collect seed. So I think with that, yep, that's the last slide. Thank you guys very much.